topic today is Stratonomics. As you can see from the slide, there is already a correction. I have already transitioned Stratonomics to Stratonotics. That's how my work, my research is very much still research in progress. Stratonomics, as Venkat mentioned, is strategy and economics. But as I was developing this theme further, that's when I realized that I kept touching the boundaries of Stratonomics, and I felt that some perspectives from political science as well would be relevant for the kind of discussions we will be having. That's the reason I've renamed Stratonomics to Stratonotics. I'll combine perspectives of research and practice as we go along. Often some of the newer thoughts which come up, they all have a trigger. The trigger in this particular case was a board meeting that I was attending. As part of that board meeting, the topic of the board discussions were that the company is too dependent on one particular country and now we need to diversify our offshoring. That was the background to the discussion. And I was part of that discussion because often as Mavuka, we work with companies on strategy consulting, resource mobilization. So companies invite us to share our perspectives on various board discussions. So here I was seeing some very intriguing discussions. The talk was about how do we reduce dependence on China. But surprisingly, no one was talking about China itself. It was almost like China is one static place. This is one thing that I found very intriguing. The second thing that I found very intriguing was that suddenly people who are sitting across the table, they keep talking of various countries. Let's go to Vietnam, let's go to Bangladesh. And for me it was like, look, these kinds of decisions are not taken on what you read in last week's Economist. These are far deeper decisions which require a lot more analysis. And the last intriguing thing that I found was that most people around the table were unduly biased by the behavior of financial investors. So these three intriguing experiences of mine became the background for what I am talking today. So this is the agenda. Instead of treating China as something static, I actually look at it as a game. So there is a game theory at work. There are some strategies which China would make, and there would be counter strategies that others would have to do. So that would be the first part of what I speak about today. The second part, addressing the lack of analysis that I mentioned in the earlier slide. I looked at 229 countries, and some of the findings of that I will share today. And lastly, having seen the bias towards the behavior of financial investors, I thought I should also share some perspectives on how strategic investors behave differently from financial investors. So that sets the agenda for today. As we get on to the first topic, which is Stratonotics, China, strategy and counter strategy, I need to take a pause and mention that strategy is always contextual. There is a context in terms of time, there is a context in terms of place, and there is a context in terms of size. As far as time is concerned, we are talking of post-COVID. as far as place is concerned, I think here I need to elaborate a bit. On account of the time and the decision making out here, which is of how do we reduce the dependence on one country, therefore one ends up in a situation of saying what will China do and what will we do. But that perspective of China versus the rest is just contextual, because the discussion is on how to diversify offshoring, how to minimize country risks, therefore companies taking a decision in terms of how do we migrate from one country to another country. That's just the context why this discussion might get on to why not China. I clarify this because I myself have many Chinese friends. I advise businesses which rely on China for their sourcing. So I am not against China, or for that matter any country at all. This is purely an academic perspective, and given the context, it gets on to how do we manage China. That's about it. The last context that I mentioned, there was one which was in terms of time, the second was the place, the third is the size. Some of the discussions that we will have today will speak of some of the newer locations which might be interesting from an offshoring perspective. But where size comes in is that the larger companies, the bigger companies, have the wherewithal to deal with unexplored territories much better as compared to smaller companies. The bigger companies can engage with governments and tell them what kind of a policy framework they might expect. The bigger companies have the size, the scale to get on to a complete ecosystem which would make things cost competitive. So the first movers might need to be the bigger companies, and the smaller companies will have to keep track in terms of what is happening. They'll have to sense the environment and then make the moves at the right time. Let's now kick on to Stratonotics at work. Although COVID struck only in December, for some time now I have been thinking that how long will the current global economic order last? Because most of us know that until about the mid-90s it was Japan, and then China came up, and I was wondering what might be the trigger when a change might come up, because these kinds of changes, these are cycles which keep happening. And that's when I hit upon this article in Harvard Business Review, September-October 2019, a very interesting headline which said, "Can China avoid a growth crisis?" And the authors concluded, yes, if its companies globalize their cultures and strategies. Now, what did Black and Morrison say? Black and Morrison say that China today is where Japan was in 1995. It's largely driven by a dynamic domestic economy. And just show you a slide to convey what we are talking about, because most of us are so enamored by China's export performance that we believe that exports must be driving the economy. And that's where in this chart I have shown GDP growth on the x-axis and the net exports minus imports of various countries. The colors are obviously the continents, the sizes are the size of the GDP. So here we can see China. The numbers relate to 2017. Domestic growth rate almost 7.5%. But when you get on to the net exports, it's marginally more than zero. That's what we mean when we say that China is largely a domestic economy. If you see Singapore up there, very high level of net exports. See Netherlands here, see Taiwan here, see South Korea here. China, and here we have Japan, These are all largely net exports, not very significant. And that is where Black and Morrison make the statement that China is largely a dynamic domestic economy. Its working age population is shrinking. And normally working age population, they are all resources. So when resources for manufacture go down, you might have trouble. Similarly, working population represents earnings, spending power. So when that declines, consumption in the economy declines. And they mention that the culture is slightly closed, and therefore when you have trouble in terms of a local labor force, then the expats coming in and integrating also becomes difficult with China, as it was with Japan several years ago. And similarly, they say that innovation might not be a solution in China. And yes, they also mention that China is high on debt. I absolutely agree with everything that Black and Morrison state. But the thought which came to my mind was, will the 1990s model of transfer of baton from Japan to China, is that going to repeat itself? So I was reminded of this very old tagline of The Economist. They used to have this tagline maybe 2 decades ago. They have now changed it. But it's a beautiful tagline. Some people believe history repeats itself. Others read The Economist. I, for one, feel that history will not repeat itself, because let's face it, China is a very different kind of a country as compared to Japan. These are some of the headlines that all of us would have seen. There are many such headlines all over the place. Here we are covering India, Trump, Japan. But once again, the thought which came to my mind is all these things which are being spoken about, are they just instinctive tactics, or they really are a part of a well thought out strategy? I'm inclined to believe that these are just tactical in nature, and I personally feel that for a strategic kind of a thought process, there's something more which is required, which is what I talk about here when I talk of the Stratonomic scenarios for post-COVID trade. As I see it, there are 2 scenarios possible. While every country is talking of self-sufficiency, one scenario is that self-sufficiency becomes the new normal, which means you actually start seeing it all around us. And scenario 2 is that self-sufficiency remains an aspiration. We may not see it as a new normal, but some aspirations may be there in various countries. We need to recognize that the offshoring from China, the purchasing from China, is all on account of a very significant strength of China, which is cost competitiveness. The difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2 is that in the case of scenario 1, if everyone were to become self-sufficient, then they will have to compromise cost competitiveness, at least in the short to medium term. It is only in that kind of a situation that a country like Japan might actually see that its economy, suddenly there is a lot more manufacture happening. But if self-sufficiency remains an aspiration, people keep talking about it, but people continue to be driven by cost competitiveness, then countries like Japan, they can keep setting apart trillions of dollars, but it's going to be difficult for them to make their way back into the new global economic order. So these are the 2 scenarios as I see it. So scenario 1 is there is a lot of protectionism by different countries, there are a lot of trade barriers by different countries, all of which make cost competitiveness not so significant. Scenario 2, people keep aspiring for it, but trade continues more or less like what it was earlier. My own guess is we will see scenario 2, which means no significant trade barriers, while people will keep saying that yes, we need to reduce our geographical risks, we need to go into self-sufficiency, all that will be there. There may be a direction towards that over several years, but for now I think it is self-sufficiency as an aspiration. Now, assuming that aspiration is there and people need to carry it forward, as I said, we need to understand China. And I thought, let's look at what are the gains which China can have. And once again, as I said earlier, I'm using the term game more in a game theory kind of a way. It is not in any other way. So one game that can be played is, why not expand the Africa model to the Middle East? As many of us are aware, China has deep relationships in Africa. Africa, as we all know, is strong in natural resources. And China has established very strong relationships with many of the rulers out there. And as you will appreciate, some of these countries, rulers change only through death or a coup. You really don't see elections coming in whereby rulers change. So there becomes some kind of a longevity to those kinds of relationships. And China has cultivated these relationships in Africa over a period of time. This is honestly no different from what the United States, for example, has done in the Middle East. So one game I am mentioning here is, what if Africa model is replicated in the Middle East by China? Because if that were to happen, then suddenly China and the United States come up eye to eye. And that can be a very dangerous situation. So that is one game that I am talking about, because just visualize the global map, the world map. If there is an axis which goes from China through Middle East to Africa, you are essentially cutting the world map diagonally. So it can have a very significant influence in terms of how trade flows across the world. That can be one very big game that China can play. The second game is this Belt and Road Initiative. What is this Belt and Road Initiative, which was earlier mentioned as OBOR, One Belt, One Road? Essentially, China is trying to build a road across all these countries, 68 countries, 65% of the world population, 40% of global GDP. So obviously we are talking of scale out here. Now, if one is to look at it from a geopolitical kind of angle, then the waters of the world are largely controlled by US and its allies. So building a road across land and co-opting the countries into that same project is another very big game that China is already on to. It's scheduled for completion in 2049. Now, what is the significance of this BRI project in today's situation? See, what's been happening is some countries have been cagey about joining this project. But as you will see from some of the numbers that I will present down the line, many countries are going to face trouble post-COVID. There are going to be job losses, there is going to be reduction in GDP, a whole lot of things will happen. These are situations when countries try to get out of the trouble through projects. But then, as you will see the numbers, some of these countries do not even have the ability to mobilize money to construct those projects. So even countries that may not have joined the BRI project so far might choose to join the project, because all said and done, if China is going to fund it, and based on that we can create employment for our own citizens, then why not? So that's the second big game that China can play. The third game that can be played is what we call currency wars. Now there are two aspects of currency wars. One is an aspect in terms of dominant currency, and the second is an aspect in terms of exchange rates. Now the dominant currency, the early part of the 20th century, the pound sterling was dominant. Post World War II, the US took over. Every country, including China, aspires to be dominant as far as currency is concerned. In the 90s, one thought maybe the euro will reach there, but unfortunately it did not. So China aspires that its currency can be the dominant currency. That's one part of the currency war. The second part of the currency war is in terms of exchange rates, where very interestingly, if you go back in history, and this is something that I have not seen a lot of economists speak about, but if one is to trace the decline of Japan, you will find that a certain event called the Plaza Accord, which was reached in 1985, it's named after a hotel called Hotel Plaza. There, some of the big countries worked out an arrangement where the US dollar currency, the strength will be reduced, and other countries' currency strength will be increased. And consequently, the Japanese yen had to become stronger. Now, what happens when your country's currency becomes stronger is that your products are no longer so competitive in the global market. I do believe that this strengthening of the yen and the sudden and the fairly significant strengthening within a single year or so had its own role in contributing to Japan's decline. The US has been trying to get China into that, but let's face it, China is a smart country, so they have not fallen into the trap. And more recently, they have launched a digital currency. Now, as I see this digital currency, if the digital currency is largely used for local payments, then it is just a more efficient payment system within the country. But if I were China, if I were to build on this, and if I had this BRI project, I would link all this funding of the BRI project to this digital currency. So in a way, China then ends up having two kinds of currency, and this is an interesting project for academicians and researchers. What are the economic implications of a country having two currencies? There's a lot of research on the implication of the same currency having two exchange rates. There's a lot of economic research on that. But two currencies for the same country, very interesting research sometime back when Zimbabwe was using that. But maybe that's an interesting research project for academicians. So as I see it, China could be having these three strategies, three games, and therefore anyone who wants to sort of outmaneuver China in this game, they will need to get on to a few counter strategy options. As I mentioned in the title slide, these are just brush strokes. These are just two possible options. They are not a complete picture at all. Several other options exist as a counter strategy, but I mention here just two things. One is international institutional interventions to mitigate Chinese expansionism. Once again, I am not using the term expansionism in any kind of a derogatory way. Every ambitious country has a right to expansionism. The entire Western world has had its expansionism. India also would love to have its presence in the global economic order expand. But if the rest of the world wants to mitigate that expansionism, And building on the strategic options that I mentioned earlier, the games that China might play, then maybe what countries might need to do is have some kind of an international institutional intervention whereby they can show countries an alternate path. Because China is well poised to present to some of these countries a path to prosperity, a path to continuation of their leadership. That path exists. China is already on that BRI path, which will be very useful in this kind of a situation. So if the rest of the world wants to mitigate that, then maybe some kind of an international institutional intervention would be required, whereby many of these countries which are going to face trouble post-COVID, they might need support, not just in terms of the monetary aspects of it. So we are not talking of the IMF kinds of intervention. Here we are talking of interventions whereby the countries are told that, look, this is a new vision for your country. And if that is to be done, it comes back to Stratonotics. There will be a strategic perspective, there will be an economic perspective, and there will be a political science perspective. So all these perspectives will have to come together. I am not sure any of the current international institutions have those kinds of genes, and therefore I am talking of maybe a new format of intervention required. The second counter strategy option, as I see it, is company strategy aligned with country strategy. This again is not new. If you look at energy in the Middle East, the US as a country and US based energy companies, there's been a lot of alignment in terms of what has been happening in the Middle East. Across the world, when it comes to large ticket purchases, whether it's aircraft, whether it's arms and ammunition, all these kinds of businesses, the entire defense space, all these activities, you do find company strategy and country strategy getting aligned. I do believe that in the years to come, we might see more of that coming up, and for me, this is a very significant risk. I'm not very happy, I'm not at all happy about company strategy getting aligned with country strategy, because it might just lead to what we call as crony capitalism. And what happens with crony capitalism is that the current leadership of all the countries, they will be able to entrench themselves in their respective countries, and that may not be very friendly in terms of free and fair elections, democracy, etc. So if we stretch this point further, suddenly we start seeing this as perhaps a fight between two political systems. China, Middle East, Africa being one kind of a political system, the rest of the world being another kind of a political system, but the whole circumstances pushing these countries into a political system which is closer to what China, Middle East and Africa is. And that really is a big concern I have when I look at the scenario today. So as you saw from these discussions, there is an aspect of strategy, there is an aspect of economics, and there is an aspect of political science, and these integrated perspectives were never so critical. Moving on to the second part, where I mentioned about different countries, I've presented a deflationary risk framework. Now, what is deflation? Deflation means that consumption in countries goes down. When does consumption in countries go down? When people don't have money or government doesn't have money. That is what I have presented here. On the x-axis you can see per capita income, and on the y-axis you can see budget surplus stroke deficit. The lower points are the deficit. So you can see countries like United States very high in terms of GDP. The significance of this is that people may not reduce their consumption. But on the other hand, if you see India out here, the GDP is so low. We are talking of something in the range of $8,000, $7,500. Now, when your GDP is at that kind of a level, you can expect consumption to take a hit. And when public consumption takes a hit, you normally hope that the government takes over. But that's where when you see the government, India, you're seeing a budget deficit which is already 3.5%. And I may add that this is just the budget deficit of the central government. If you add the deficits of the states, you will probably find India somewhere here, which is closer to 9%. And that is even pre-COVID. So post-COVID, how do you ramp up the economy? Where do you get the money? Because you're already so deep in terms of a budget deficit, people don't have the money. And that's the reason there is so much of talk about a stimulus. And the government really has a challenging problem in terms of how do we avoid a deflation. For the purposes of understanding the countries, what I did is I took a base of 229 countries. These are economic numbers from the CIA's World Fact Book. From those 229 countries, I applied certain filters. I said geographical area more than 35,000. Because if you want to be a global factory, you need to have a large enough geographical area. And 35,000 square kilometers is the size of Taiwan. And Taiwan is the smallest East Asian tiger. Labor force, at least 8.5 million. Because Taiwan in the mid-90s had this kind of a labor force. So when I applied this filter, the total number of countries became 60. Then I said, look, the population needs to be young. So a median age less than 35, this brought the numbers down to 42. And lastly, I said certain countries, the geopolitical risk is high. People may not want to go there. People may minimize that those countries may not become the global factories. So accordingly, the numbers go down to 35. So when I look at those 35, this is the listing. I won't run through this. I'll ensure that you guys get the presentation. So when I look at this deflationary risk framework and I apply it to these 35 countries, that's where you see a Saudi Arabia is so high in terms of per capita income, and therefore its consumption economics may not take a hit. Okay, although if you see the budget deficit, Saudi Arabia 2017 numbers, the budget deficit was a good 8%, which is a real challenge. So if one is to look at the countries other than Saudi Arabia, which is what is presented here, less than 10,000 of per capita income, you have almost 50% of these 35 countries out there. These are all countries, many of them also with weak budget deficit issues, and therefore deflation is something to plan for. What is the implication of deflation, we will see later. I've also looked at a commodity risk framework, because what is going to happen over the next few years is commodity prices will be under trouble. If economic growth is suffering, GDP growth is suffering, the price of oil is already declining. So then countries which are highly dependent on those natural resources, they might face trouble. This is where you see Saudi Arabia here with a very high percentage of their GDP coming in from natural resources. Same with Angola, very high. And that's where when you see India out here, India is not so strong when it comes to natural resources. So the country is not dependent on natural resources. It's got some diversity of an industry base, which is what is good for India. So from a commodity risk perspective, India might be better off. India will actually be a beneficiary of all these decline in oil prices. Going further, debt or alive. We are reaching a stage where having debt might come in the way of surviving, and therefore I looked at the public debt of countries and the external debt of countries. And external debt, I just reduced whatever reserves the country already has got in terms of foreign currency. So when one looks at it that way, that's when you see, a country like Ethiopia so high in terms of external debt. When you look at India, India, in terms of external debt as a percentage of the fixed reserves, it is quite comfortable. That's because a lot of foreign currency reserves have been built in India. We have a good $475 billion of foreign currency and gold. So on the external front, we are pretty safe, but on the domestic front, we already have 75% of the gross domestic product as public debt. And now we are saying more debt may be required for a stimulus. So this again becomes a trouble spot for India. So what I did is I just combined some of these parameters that I have listed out here, and I made a very basic equal weighted kind of a score. The message for the academicians: neither these factors nor the scales are based on strict research. They are more directional. I wanted to see what the combination of these factors yield in terms of which might be the better country. And what I found was India, Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico, these are countries which probably have a head start when it comes to taking part of whatever China is doing into their own geography. A cluster analysis of these 35 countries shows that India is the most differentiated amongst them, followed by Brazil. Towards the right, one can see all the African countries clustered together. So India and Brazil really stand out. But what can spoil India's party? One is the public debt problem that I mentioned. Second is the management of the budget deficit. Third is we unfortunately are in a situation where bank balance sheets, company balance sheets, and personal balance sheets, everything is in a mess. Then we do have an issue in terms of policy flux, because ideally there should be an overall policy framework which is debated, well thought out, and then actions need to flow from that policy. But we seem to have got on to a mode where action has become the policy itself, and one finds that all the players in the economy, most of the time they are scampering around to somehow survive the policy, and that is not a good environment for companies to flourish, companies to focus on innovation, etc. And the last point is social unrest itself, which again is something we need to be careful about. In particular, if one is to look at, if we were to see a deflationary environment, GDP going down, consumption going down, people not having jobs, all that can lead to social unrest, which is something we need to be careful about. Now I get on to the last part of it, where I spoke of the financial investors versus the strategic investors. Now, what happens in a deflation? As I mentioned, consumption goes down. Now, when consumption goes down, overall level of economic activity is going down, then you do find that stock markets might go down. So financial investors will go based on stock market and they will move away. But when it comes to strategic investors are people who are going to be using the country for their products, to source their products, and for them deflation will actually be good, and they will find that they are able to outsource their products, they are able to buy products from the country in a deflationary situation much cheaper than what they would do in an inflationary situation. So long as we ensure that there is an overall order in society, there is a balance in terms of policy, so long as all that happens, deflation might actually be good for the country from the point of view of attracting strategic investors. And the problems that we spoke of in terms of consumption and budget deficit can actually be made up when international investors come in and they choose to take the benefit of what is happening in India. So that's all I have. I'll be happy to take questions.
Yes, Sundar. There seems to be a tidal flow of questions pouring in.
That's interesting.
And we have about 10 minutes actually for the Q&A session.
Okay.
I don't know if I'll be able to actually mention all the questions.
Perfect. In fact, I have a suggestion on that. What you could probably do is that while you raise a few questions which you find which you can prioritize, the rest of it, if you can just put them together and send it to me as email, I could actually put down the answers also and maybe present them somewhere in social media where people can reach out and read. That's one way of handling it. I'll be happy to do that.
No, that's a wonderful idea, Sundar. So for the next about say 8-9 minutes, let me run through at least the prioritized kind of questions.
Okay.
One question coming from MBA Semester 4 student from Amity, Dubai, Gurpal Singh.
Okay.
His question is, how will companies manage the raw material inventory and cash flow position to get manufacturing up and running again post-COVID?
That's a very interesting question, because see, if you were to look at it, the whole corporates across the world kept on improving efficiency, and we kept getting on to what we called as just-in-time, JIT, a concept pioneered by Japan. But suddenly we will graduate to a mode where instead of just-in-time, we will start doing just-in-case, JIC instead of JIT. Inventory levels will go up. There will obviously be a level of dislocation in the near future where companies may start manufacture, they may not have the raw materials, etc. But going forward, I do see a lot of inventory build-up in companies, a switch from JIT to JIC, just in case, and therefore efficiencies of companies, margins, interest costs, everything going up.
Okay, great, Sundar. There is another question that I've got from another MBA student called Anandu. I'm trying to see what this question is about, but what he's trying to ask is, now we all know that COVID is there in all parts of the world and it started from China. And we all also know that China uses a lot of artificial intelligence as the other parts of the world. So going forward, do you think China will depend on AI-based technology to tackle the situation going forward?
I would say not just China, the entire world is going to use artificial intelligence. And let's face it, what South Korea did without any kind of a lockdown in terms of controlling COVID was very significantly AI based. And once again, very interestingly, if you go back to the World Economic Forum, the rankings of countries, you will find that South Korea is ranked at the top when it comes to ICT. And after seeing their experience in terms of using AI for controlling COVID, I can say the World Economic Forum ranking for ICT at least is absolutely on the ball.
Thank you, Sundar. There is another interesting question. The oil market was recently shaken by the falling oil prices. What does this mean to you? Can you please explain the phenomenon and its impact on the global economy?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. I think the first thing I'd like to clarify here is that what went to negative, in fact, was actually the oil futures. It was not the oil physical commodity. Because what happens with futures is that end of a settlement period, you need to balance out things, and if you don't balance out, you'll have to take delivery of oil. And people were obviously not in a position to take delivery of thousands of barrels of oil. So they wanted to get out of that position through whatever means, and that ended up in a situation where oil futures turned negative. Having said that, oil prices have indeed been going down, and that is where a country like India might benefit. So all countries which are import intensive in terms of energy will benefit. That's a good point for these countries, but it is bad obviously for oil exporters. Like whether you look at Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, for all of them it's going to be trouble. But there's another aspect of this oil price decline which I don't think has received much mileage in the normal media, which is this choice between oil and the cleaner fuels. And my concern is that if oil prices go down too much, people might start making switches from cleaner fuel to oil, and that may not be good for the environment. That is a concern I do have.
Sundar, thank you for that answer. I think we have time for maybe one question or maybe one more. The question goes like this: strategy, economics, and political science. Which discipline do you think is most likely to take the lead in Stratonomics, or for the matter, Stratonotics?
That's a really good one, and I'm going to be challenged because I have friends in all three domains. But let me still put my foot forward. See, between the three disciplines, economics is a relatively dense discipline, and because it is dense, it is difficult for strategists and political science professionals to dig into economics. So that's a challenge for the two of them. But having said that, while I have interacted with some very great economists, I do believe that many economists, they get caught in what we call as the ceteris paribus world. Ceteris paribus is Latin for other things being constant. So when you are too driven by a concept of other things being constant, and today suddenly you have to get on to a mode where even constant things need to change, I think many economists might find themselves challenged. And purely because of that, I do feel that maybe strategists and people from the political science space might start looking at Stratonotics a lot more intensively, and maybe obviously ultimately professionals from all three disciplines will have to get together and come out with good, effective solutions and decision making frames for business.